Well, welcome Australian Veteran News viewers. Today, or this afternoon, I'm very, very pleased to be speaking to Barry Zworestine, who is a veteran of the Rhodesian Bush War, but he's also a clinical psychologist who works in the education sector. He also works with veterans through Open Arms. He's written a couple of very insightful and very worthwhile books for veterans and current serving soldiers and sailors and airmen who are considering their transition out of the service. And one of them is Which Way is Your Claymore Facing? And it's an operating manual, I think you describe it as, Barry.
Yep.
And the other one is another operating manual, which is Which Way is Your Warrior Facing? And I think it's asked some very in that particular one, asked some very insightful questions about preparing for the transition from service, and which way you're claymore facing provides some incredible insights and very useful things in a language that I think veterans can easily understand and relate to. And, you know, with little tips such as, you know, you've got to start somewhere and take small steps and things like that. They're just basic, but very, very valuable you know, sets of guidelines and that kind of thing based on, I guess, perhaps your own experience and the clinical work that you do, Barry.
Yeah, and Mark, just to say before I drop myself in a professional deep dark hole,
Yeah.
I've got a master's in clinical psychology, but in Australia I'm registered as a psychologist. So.
Okay, I think I understand the subtleties there, but
Yep.
that's fine. They were my words, not yours, and that's terrific. So look. The purpose of this interview, this this little meeting today, is on the 26th of May. We've got you booked in to present at an event we're calling Veterans at Bentleigh. Now, Veterans at Bentleigh is actually not just going to be at Bentleigh, but we're going to stream it live, and it'll be an opportunity for people and veterans anywhere in the world to participate in that event. And I'm really looking forward to having you there as our keynote speaker, Barry, and you're going to be talking about some of the transitional things and some of your experiences, and hopefully leave our audience with some insights and give them a chance to ask some questions and interact with you. But before we did that, I thought it'd be really lovely to spend 15, 20 minutes with you having a little chat so we can find out a little bit about the man behind the presentation, because you're going to be tackling a very difficult topic, and a lot of people have been, everybody wants to try and solve these transition issues. A lot of money goes into it in terms of research.
Yeah.
DVA and the government turning themselves inside out, trying to work out how to make it better for everybody. And you've got your offering and your very practical work. So I think it'd be terrific to know a bit more about you, where you've come from, how you got to this point. So I guess to open up with, do you want to perhaps give us a little bit of a background as to how you got to wanting to be a psychologist?
Well, I did. I fell into being a clinical psychologist, a writer, and transformed back into a psychologist.
Yeah,
and
the books and those sorts of things. What got you to that point?
So, I was born, my country went through 3 or 4 changes of government. So I was born in a country called Southern Rhodesia, which was a British colony, and we pound, shillings and pence and God save the Queen. And then our Prime Minister got the hell in and declared independence, and we became known as Rhodesia. In Rhodesia, we were pretty much the breadbasket of Africa. And in fact, at some point, our currency was stronger than the British pound. But then, of course, that attracted a lot of attention from a number of countries in Africa. And we are surrounded by 3 black countries and South Africa beneath us. So in the 70s, increasingly, there were incursions into our country from the 3 countries surrounding us. And it was more incursions in the border. So our war was called the Rhodesian Bush War as a result, because it wasn't an urban warfare, it was a bush warfare. That went on for a long period of time. I fought in that from 76, 77. And then I left, I went back to university.
How old were you, Barry, during that time?
I was quite old, because I was already at university for 4 years. I did a degree and then a high school teaching diploma, and realized I still hated school, and I was never going to teach. So I then went, I got called up, I think I was about 23. So I was an old bloke, because I was fighting with guys who were 18, 17. So I was not seen as a youngster. And then I think I left, and I meandered. Coming out of my war, in the 70s, which is very much sort of towards the end of the Vietnam era, there was not much knowledge about post-traumatic stress disorder or anything like that. So we all just bolted out of the war into civilian life, and I think a lot of us made an awful mess. I had 3 or 4 immigrations, a couple of marriages. It was a mess, but none of us could really identify why we were struggling. I arrived back at university, I think 2 or 3 weeks after I'd finished operating. And, in our war, we were operating in 4-man sticks. So 4-man sticks in territory where terrorists would walk from between 30 to 300 in one case. So the levels of hypervigilance were huge, and we were very thin on the ground, which comes with its own issues, irrespective of what happens around that. So I arrived back at university, and I was waking up 20 odd times a night. I had body aches and pains. I was hypervigilant. People said, I was talking really fast, quite distracted. So I had the classical symptoms, which were unknown.
Mm.
So they did their fair share of reaping disaster on various parts of my journey as I bolted through South Africa, England. I tried to cycle to Israel, actually, from England on a mountain bike with thongs on, and no map. To do that, something has to have gone wrong. But eventually ended up in Israel and spent 4 years there, back to South Africa. And eventually I returned back here. So when I initially went back to South Africa, before returning to South Africa, I decided that I had to head in with education. So I went back to university, and there was really nothing for me to do except my mates were now running the psychology department. So they said, be a psychologist. So in many ways, it was by default. It wasn't a choice. That was it if I was going to create change. So I had to go through finishing off psychology 2 and 3 in 1 year, and then an honors, and then apply to get into the clinical masters. Now, I must preface this by saying I really have a problem studying. I have a couple of learning issues. So studying for me is not an easy affair. So I suffered for those 4 years.
Yeah. Do you think those deeply personal experiences that you had equipped you to be a psychologist? Shaped your work in a way that perhaps it wouldn't have if you hadn't had those experiences?
Look, I think the best thing I can say is I think my military service was probably the thing that informed me the most, because, with every veteran and current serving I've sat with over the past 18, 19 years with Open Arms, the one thing that's consistent to all is a desire for service. And, the heart of being a psychologist should be a desire for service. And that certainly wasn't informed by anything else in my life. It was really informed by the values and the attributes of being in the military, and of that sense of kinship and brothers around you where you watch each other's backs. And, those really informed a part of who I am, and really informed the work I do. And so it wasn't surprising that when I got back here, I was approached. Open Arms had got permission to employ external contractors in about 2002. I think it was right at the very beginning. And I just had this calling because for a while I had felt as a psychologist that I wanted to actually help the Rhodesians around the world. And so I'd had that in the back of my hat as well. And so when Open Arms spoke to me, I gave them my background, and I came on as a contractor. And so I've worked in a school, but I've never, outside of my private practice, I've really only worked with the military referrals from Open Arms. I don't really see anyone outside of that, because a part of who I am has an absolute fit with the men and the women that I work with. And I've often said that the people I sit with as a result of my background are not clients or patients. In many ways, they're brothers, or brothers as in male, female. And there's a kinship and an understanding of territory between us. And, when I talk about the things I do talk about, because I draw on operational terminology and all sorts of stuff, there's a level at which they get it and they understand and they trust it. So I'd say the value of my military service was that it's really brought me to where I am today, working with the people that I do work.
How important, Barry, is the having the skills and I guess the personal knowledge of the narrative, the stories, the ability to talk about, the subtle things that I think if you're not a veteran or if you've never served and you read the title of a book, which way
Yeah,
you're playing or facing, it would
yeah,
mean almost nothing. But everybody I know who has that background knows exactly what that's about.
yes.
Particularly if they've served with the army. So, how important is it that ability to communicate at that level? I guess is it.
Look, I think there are large numbers of psychologists serving veterans, and I think they do it extremely well. So I think having or not having operational experience, I think doesn't determine the work you do. But what I found was over the years, I realized that as I was working with veterans, I was realizing that I was starting to draw more and more on operational tools to create learning and healing. I
Mm,
was taking people back into their territory. I'd start off saying that the first thing you have to do is a rescue mission, which is to go back and rescue the good parts and the positive parts of yourself and not leave your veteran behind. I then started talking about pull throughs, the cleaning of a barrel.
yep.
And I explained to guys that, if you don't clean your barrel, you're going to get an accidental discharge, you're going to get a runaway gun, or you're going to get a stoppage. And those would translate to sudden bursts of anger, out of control, or depression and anxiety. So already they're going, okay, that makes sense. And then I started formulating a series of pull through tools. So it's all, and I talk about looking at your arcs of fire, situational awareness, going from your ambush zone to your OP. So everything I use is in the language that people understand and they connect to, it makes sense. So in that respect, my style of working with individuals is very much informed by my history. And part of why I've written what I've done is not just for the veterans, but I think if psychologists also were willing to understand and learn some of the ways that I do communicate, anybody can use it.
Mhm.
And
Do you
it
think
is
it's
effective.
yeah? Do you think it's important for veterans and their families to seek experiences and support from people outside of the veteran community as well?
And look, I mean, any veteran and family is eligible to contact Open Arms. And, the support is free. So my question would be, why go outside and pay for it when you have a doorway through to an organization that is extraordinary? Every psychologist is looked at very carefully. We fall under the territory of Open Arms. We're responsible to Open Arms. We're part of a tribe rather than a solo practitioner
Mm.
working wherever. So
What
I
I
would,
guess, Barry, what I
yeah,
was talking about, rather than the direct support around psychological services
mm,
and things like that, I'm sort of aiming at getting outside of the veteran circle, I suppose. And I'm wondering what your view is and how important that is, because we've talked a lot about the importance of being able to
yeah,
understand and come to that background.
yeah,
But I'm certainly wondering about, well, you don't want to stay just in that single orbit either. And
no.
I guess that's what I'm venturing into.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Mark, I mean, my attitude with that is that um, transitioning into civilian life is an inevitability. No one is going to be staying in the military forever. It's just not going to be possible. So at some point in time, you have to return to civilian territory. And part of your skill set is to learn how you adjust and adapt. Civilian territory is not going to adjust and adapt to veterans. You have to learn to speak the language. You have to learn to connect with people. You have to look at how you talk, because military talk and civilian talk are very different. So your point that we do have to learn to integrate is critical, and it's important, because if we're just forming a narrow ivory tower of veterans, we never transition. And, I see in my war,
Mm.
numbers of people are totally encapsulated in a war that happened over 60 years ago, and they've never moved beyond it.
Yeah.
And I think that's almost being institutionalized into war. And in many ways, you can become institutionalized into trauma
Yeah.
because you're not actually stepping into different territories. So it is pretty.
I mean, this may be controversial, but do we run a risk of, because we're putting a lot of effort and support around veterans at the moment, that we're institutionalising people as veterans in a way? And how do we make sure that we safeguard that we don't create this sort of insular world of an in-group of veterans, so to speak?
Look, within Open Arms, for example, a lot of work and workshops and attention is given around relationships, and also integrating into and finding a place for yourself in a civilian world. And so if it's done properly, then the goal of the support is to help people to transition through into a new life and not to get stuck in the past.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's done properly, it shouldn't be a problem at all.
Okay, and so Barry, what are some of the I don't want to take away anything from that you're going to be speaking to us about on the 26th, of course.
Okay.
But can you share, perhaps a little bit of an insight into some of the more common problems that veterans in transition should be thinking about, and may not have an awareness that they are facing those difficulties, but if somebody put a label on it, it might just help them recognise it.
Well, I invented. We'll save what it means for the talk, if that helps. Yeah. But I invented something called PMTC. And PMTC is a way of looking at the transitional process. Because if you think about it, when men and women transition, they can get a bit lost. They haven't transitioned, loss of identity, grief. Where do I belong? What do I work? What's my purpose? What's my meaning? So anxiety and depression, alcohol use, folks stop exercising, they put on weight, depression deepens, alcohol increases, they start waking up at night, maybe some operational stuff jumps in. And the question I always raise is, are we looking at post-traumatic stress disorder, or are we looking at transitional challenges? So I think the first thing that I believe very strongly in is to actually map out and effectively map out the layers inherent in the transitioning process. And I think a lot of my writing, and that's really born out of 18 or 19 years of sitting with extraordinary human beings and formulating all the different layers that come up, and even things I've seen in myself. And once that's mapped out, a person can locate themselves on a map, because you can give them a compass and they can go, aha, I know where I am. When you know where you're on the map, you're still in the driver's seat, so your capacity to navigate through it is more effective. Then the other thing is, so what do we do? And like any good operation, you need to be able to have tools. You need to be able to know your arcs of fire. You need to have situational awareness. So you need to bring all of these old skills into the transitioning process, combined with ways to, as I say, pull through. So there are a lot of stresses. And if we don't pay attention to stress, well, things are going to go down. And so I often find that in the transitioning process, before we jump into core impacts, let's get people back in their bodies. Let's get their barrel clean, so they're more ready to deal with what's happening.
Right. Okay. And so this is where the sort of things like physical fitness and healthy eating and those sorts of things come into play.
Yeah, completely. And lately, the last probably year, I've become a great devotee of the Wim Hof approach, which is cold water therapy and breathing. Now, I'm not saying breathing's for everyone, but cold water is profound. I do the breathing, and I've got a series of tools. So there's an endless number of tools that I use. And what I say to guys is, work out what you like, and let's get a discipline. Mark, the biggest thing I say is, any healing, you have to be willing to become comfortable being uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And that's at the essence of a veteran, isn't it?
And that's one of the principles, isn't it, that you have in one of the books. I guess one of the other things that I was sort of contemplating when you were speaking about that is just around the sort of support that people need, and the sort of I would say, and I've done a little bit of research, nothing probably as extensive as you have, but I've certainly been looking at transition experiences of people, veterans, and particularly reservists who've been on operations overseas, and then they come back and they transition to civilian employment. And I've done a fairly in-depth study on a limited number of people around that. And one of the things that I would say is that you can see patterns, but I would also suggest that no two experiences are the same.
No.
So I guess the thing that I would be interested in getting your insights on is, we can discuss these tools, these guides, all these things that people can do. But how important is it, in your opinion, that people also get some other way of gaining support and feedback and things like that?
Look, I suppose my core mission is to prepare people to navigate through territory and manage the whatever arises in their bodies and get them ready. From there, you will have others that will step in and help them write their CVs, interviews, the career stuff. So my focus is not on that. It's not my skill set, and I'm not able to do that. That would be, and I know that, for example, in America, things like the Honor Foundation, which deals with SEALs and Delta Force Green Berets, and it helps them, and their sole mission is to create a very powerful transitioning process.
So apart from government programs and, you know, psychologists, open arms and things like that, what's the role for ex-service organisations, even some of the looser associations out there? Do they have an important role to play in all this as well?
Yeah, I mean, there are some great organisations that are starting. Swiss 8, for example. I mean, the boys there are, I think, working very constructively. And I think when you have veterans with skill sets where they can actually help individuals transition effectively into jobs and employment and really find meaning and purpose, I think we're not as developed as America is at the moment, because there are numbers of very strong organizations. The SEAL Team Foundation, I think, that's run by the mother of Mark Lee, who was the first SEAL killed in action. And Debbie's extraordinary, and they do everything from health and all the various treatments around that to transitioning. You know, the Honor Foundation with all their stuff, Mission 22 by Magnus Johnson, ex-Green Beret. So it's very developed there, and I'm hoping that more and more this will be something that will develop, in which the well-being and the soul of the veteran is dealt with and managed, and then from there others will step in and help them find their place. So they don't necessarily end up highly skilled individuals doing manual labor. For me, that's nothing wrong with manual labor, but people with skill sets, let's get them into places where they have meaning.
Well, it's more than just a skill set, though, isn't it? I mean, they come, as you pointed out earlier in your self-introduction, that people come with a whole bunch of skills and experiences and mindsets and all those other things that are, it's more valuable than the fact that somebody might have been a transport driver or something like that, or a gunner or something. It's the other things that they did outside of that job title that are probably the most valuable things that they have available to them. And I guess from my perspective, I get a little frustrated when I see, the simple programs of, well, let's get your CV in order and we'll translate your work ticket, your employment category into a civilian, certificate or something, and we'll put that on a CV. I think that misses the point significantly for a lot of veterans in transition who want to transition. They don't necessarily want to be that person anymore, and they want to move into something more prospective and a little bit more growth oriented. And so in one way you're saying you don't want to leave those good bits behind, but you don't want to sort of keep living through that, be defined by those experiences either forever.
I think the core thing for me is when you go back and get yourself and rescue yourself or heal yourself, what you're doing is you're bringing your core attributes with you, which is the capacity to be in service, respect for other, self-sacrifice, the needs of others important, dependability, reliability. Now those make an extraordinary human, and to some extent I think they're a little bit shortchanged in civilian life, which is more I-centered. So I really sort of see that as, don't leave yourself behind, because who you were as a human being has extraordinary values. Let's keep those values as you integrate into civilian life. And so it's what I call that healthy integration between the military person and the civilian person. They mold together with the core strengths inherent in both.
So there's a lot of some big ideas amongst this, and some very clear, in my mind anyway, that I can see some clear truths in what you're saying. How is this translated in your experience to impact when you're able to share some of these ideas and help veterans through the process? Have you got any stories or anything you can share about that sort of impact?
Look, I've, in terms of how veterans have shifted and moved in the work I've done with them, or at a bigger picture with organizations looking at the transitioning process. Yeah,
I'm guessing there's a real impact here, and I'm interested in a little bit more.
it's
knowing a bit
huge.
more
I
about that.
mean, I've had individuals, currently people are going through a lot of stress and challenges. And what I've done is I go back to basics with the pull-throughs, looking after your well-being and reframing in military terms. And I've seen people shift in 2-3 weeks. They're moving out of it because it's not trauma-based. It's the challenges of a current situation. In those that have come out of operational and into transitional issues, because I'm building layer by layer, I'm giving them maps and a compass, and I'm giving them tools. And at the same time, I'm working with anything that needs to be healed. They're transitioning incredibly well. I think over the 18 years, I've seen people do extremely well. And that's not just because of me. I think it's also because of who they are. But, I'm not an academic. And I know there's large funds being poured into this. I'm a psychologist, but on the ground, I'm just a bloke. I always say the work I do is nothing academic. It's dusty, it's on the ground, and it lives in the territory. And people are free to use it and not free to use it, but I trust it. It resonates with me, and it resonates with the people I work with. I'm always open to change and becoming better. But, I work on where the feet are on the ground. I start from there and stay there and journey with the guys I sit with. I think there's some great work being done, and I think the investigation into veteran suicides is going to be excellent. But, we can't be everywhere, and I know what territory I'm good in, and I work at that territory.
Yeah, so it sounds like you've really identified your niche, and you're seeking to that all that story comes to that apex with you, I think, at the moment.
Yeah.
When you speak to us on the 26th, what's going to be the frame of your keynote presentation, without giving away every part of it? But
yeah.
what are you going to direct us through for 10 or 15 minutes?
Look, I'm going to look
questions and answers as well, so they might go in any direction once people start getting involved.
That's cool. I'm predominantly going to look at which, as I'm going to call it, is which way is your veteran facing. I want to talk about where you're facing. I want to talk about what lies ahead of you. I want to reform things and talk about the tools and the understandings, OP, your ambush zones. I want to give people listening to it something they can walk away with and immediately start to apply it to their lives. I want to give them a roadmap that comes from their territory, the integrity of their territory and the strength of their territory, and that they can use that roadmap at any point in time in that transition process. That'll be my goal. And I also want to talk about my thinking around PMTC, PTSD, PTS, combat stress, and just play a little bit with terminology and what I think about some of it.
Well, Barry, I'm very much looking forward to it. I'm sure quite a few of our listeners and viewers are looking forward to the presentation as well. It's going to be great. I'm glad we're going to be able to record it and share it with people outside of the venue. But I think those who will be there, having you zooming in and being part of it and being able to speak to you directly, I think is going to be a wonderful thing. And that'll be the same for anybody else who joins us online as well. And it's a great privilege to have the opportunity to talk to you and have you as our guest speaker for the 26th of May. So Barry, the books they're not for sale, they're for free. And
don't worry about the Amazon. Don't worry about that one there. Which way is your Claymore facing? Don't worry about that one.
Yeah.
That one there is a free PDF.
Yeah.
I think you've got it, so you can throw it to everybody who registers. If people email me, I mean, they can go on my website. I just have to get my wife to have a look at that and check. They can just download it. I have to make sure that it's done. So that's free, and I always tell people, grab it, print it out, distribute it, do what you want with it. Excellent.
Well, look, we'll certainly make, with your permission, make that available through our site as well, either directly or with a link, and we'll share some contact details as well. You might get inundated. Hopefully, it's not too much of a burden for you, but I know you're really passionate about supporting the community and I guess growing this sort of a different style of practice, which I think is really important as well. And there's lots of different ways this needs to be approached. And somebody with that experience and background getting involved is terrific. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation in a couple of weeks' time, Barry. So thank you very much.
Yeah, well, thanks, Mark. And also just to say, really, thanks for the opportunity. I mean, to be of service is probably the biggest meaning in my life. And I always think I'm probably more grateful for the human beings I've sat with than they may be to me, because what an opportunity to be of service to extraordinary men and women. So, thanks to you all.